So once again, thank you so much to the organizers, because you are doing a wonderful job. And I have to be very honest with you. When I saw the wonderful list of speakers and I received the invitation, my first reaction was to say, no, I don't want to go, because the other speakers are so wonderful that I don't want to use their time. But then the organizers, CEIBS students, told me about the topic, UN, the origin. And then I was deeply moved, attracted by the topic. And I told them, well, I will be with you. Why I am so attracted by this topic, UN, the origin? Because in fact, when you think about it, and we are here to have a reflection together, it is an invitation to think about a very rich contrast in terms of the way we look at time. Are we looking at time as something linear? And by the way, this approach of time, it is something very modern, and I would say that this is a very important feature of Western modernity, a linear approach of time. Or are we looking at time as something cyclical? Linearity or the approach of time as something cyclical. And of course, since we are in China, we know that we cannot understand China and the Chinese dynamics if we don't remember that for China, time traditionally has been approached as something cyclical. Remember the first sentence of the Three Kingdoms, 天下大时 分久必合 合久必分. You see, this is an example of a cyclical understanding of time, and I will come back to that in a minute when I discuss the Chinese dynamics and the Chinese Renaissance. But before I do that, I would like to tell you that whatever we are going to say, we need to remember that we live in a world which has never been so complex. And I invite us to put aside the notion of globalization and more to try to understand why our world has never been so complex. And when you think about that, a way to introduce to this unprecedented level of complexity is to think about the combination of 4 factors of change. Number 1, population. We are in a wonderful business school, but even in a wonderful business school, sometimes we don't think enough about demography, but demography matters. And you remember that we live in a little village of 7.5 billion people, but what we need to keep in mind is that in 2050, we will be 10 billion. And this increase in terms of population is creating a world which has never been so complex. We could talk about the increase of life expectancy. We could talk about the urbanization phenomenon. These are all related to demography. The second element, creating a world which has never been so complex, is of course the technological change. You know that very well, the digital space, And you and I, we know that we live already in a world of algorithms. Artificial intelligence is everywhere, and we don't know how this artificial intelligence is going to impact the societies in which we live. But this is clearly a very important factor of change. The third element creating an unprecedented complexity is what I would love to call power diffusion. In fact, I look at you and I am amazed by what I see. I see, of course, people, but I see a lot of mobile phones, mobile devices. And since you have this mobile device in your hand, you can do two things. Number one, access to information. This is new. And this is an empowerment for individuals, of course, this access to information. And you can also broadcast. We live in a world, of course, of social networks, which is changing many things for our societies and also for the way we organize ourselves politically. And the fourth factor of change is, of course, about geopolitics. And we come gradually to the topic of our day. When we think about geopolitical change, we always use the shift from bipolarity, unipolarity, to multipolarity. We like to use the notion of multipolarity. Of course, our world is multipolar. This is not the world of the G7, this is not the world of the G8, this is the world of the G20. So many countries do matter. But today, one of the messages I would like to convey is to tell you that we need to go beyond multipolarity. We need to understand what we could call a multi-conceptual world. We live in a world in which we do not have one understanding of modernity, but several understandings of what it means to be modern. And one of the most interesting examples of multi-conceptuality is, of course, what is happening in this country, in China. The Chinese Renaissance is an introduction to a multi-conceptual world. What is the Chinese Renaissance, in my humble opinion? Well, by the way, you just have to look around, to think about the history of CEIBS, to listen to what the speakers are going to say, and you will have an idea of what is the Chinese Renaissance. But I would like to tell you 4 things about the Chinese Renaissance. Number one, when we think about China as a market, when we think about the Chinese economy, please let us stop to say that China is emerging. You know very well, because you are able to think and to observe from the Chinese context, that when you take history, that is the origin, into account, China is only coming back to a position of centrality, which was the position of China for many centuries. What is going on from an economic perspective is not an emergence from nowhere, but a rapid economic re-emergence. So the West is very surprised, but in Beijing, in Shanghai, and all across China, the Chinese people understand that it is only coming back to normality. The second element defining the Chinese Renaissance that I would like to present is what I would call China's socio-political transformation. And this is very striking for an external observer. The fact that when you think about that, when you compare today's China with yesterday's China, the Chinese individuals never, ever enjoyed such a degree of individual freedom. Freedom to travel abroad, freedom to study abroad, and freedom, of course, to create a company. The entrepreneurial spirit which is at work in today's China is absolutely unique. But what I would like to present is the idea that the outcome of this socio-political transformation will not be what the West considers to be the political modernity. China is inventing. China is on the path to invent her own political modernity in connection, in continuity with the Chinese culture, the Chinese history, and the Chinese political tradition. And this is a very interesting concept that we need to understand, the connection between today's Chinese governance and yesterday's Chinese governance. Third, and this is probably the most important aspect of our conversation, China is not only a market. China is much more, in my narrative, than a political entity. China is a civilization. And I would even say that China is a living matrix of civilization. And when you look at China as a civilization, and when you try to understand the Chinese dynamics, you come to the idea that from a Chinese perspective, but the world has to understand, to empathize with this perspective. From a Chinese perspective, modernization cannot mean westernization. 现代化不意味着西方化. And therefore, in order to analyze this process, we need to look at two different things, the visible and the invisible. And what is happening when you look at the Chinese civilization, the metamorphosis of this civilization from a visible perspective? Well, I would tell you what I see is not the fact that Chinese people are abandoning Chineseness. No. Chinese people, even the Ling Ling Ho, even the young Chinese, they are trying to reinvent, renew the Chineseness, to reinvent what it means to be Chinese. This is the visible. And at the invisible, China is in a fascinating phase and process, not of abandoning China's classical tradition, but in a process of reinterpreting Chinese classical tradition in order for China to enter her own modernity. And this reinterpretation is also a reflection upon the notion of origin from a Chinese perspective. Time is flying, but I would like to tell you also that we cannot understand the 21st century Chinese Renaissance if we do not pay attention to the unprecedented Chinese global projection. China is projecting herself globally through at least 8 vectors: goods, technology, people, finance and companies, culture, military, of course, diplomacy. Think about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a very important initiative, and by the way, not a jump into the unknown. The Belt and Road would not exist as a new Silk Road without the ancient Silk Road, which was the connection between the Roman Empire and the Han dynasty. Always a comeback, a cycle, if you wish. And the eighth in my narrative vector of Chinese global projection would be the intellectual global projection. And this is new, and this will have a huge impact. You want to give me an example of this Chinese intellectual global projection? I would use only one. 人类命运共同体. How do you translate 人类命运共同体? I would translate it by community of destiny for mankind. Do you think it is a jump into the unknown? 人类命运共同体. Why there is this notion that I fully support of 人类命运共同体? Well, I think because some people in Beijing understand where China comes from, and a very important concept of the Chinese tradition, as you know, has been the concept of Dadong, the grand harmony or the great unity. And you can think about 人类命运共同体 as a reinterpretation for the 21st century of this notion of Dadong. So therefore, I need to conclude, but it takes us back to these two approaches of time, a linear approach or cyclical approach. You know, one of the most profound elements of the Chinese tradition is what you call yin-yang tu, this representation of the yin and the yang in a circle. And I would like you, I came to you in a very simple way. I have no PPT and I have no photos. But I would like you to visualize, to imagine again this yin-yang tu. You imagine that. And you will remember, you will realize that there is no line in this yin-yang tu. Only circles, circle and circles. And of course, the yin is not here the opposite of the yang, the exclusive opposite of the yang. You know very well that the yin and the yang. And I'm going to end by this very simple idea. We are here to think about Yuan, the origin. What is Yuan? I don't think it is the beginning. I don't think it is the end. Yuan is the beginning and the end. And it takes us at another level of understanding of the difference between the West and China. The West is not comfortable with contradictions. China takes her life from contradictions. I'm going to end now, but I know that this end is simply a beginning. This is the origin. Yuan, 谢谢大家。